A canine German Shepherd puppy blocks the road. When police discover why, they break down in tears. The night was dark, and headlights sliced through the empty road. Drivers honked, swerving to avoid a small figure standing motionless in the middle of the highway. Some yelled out their windows. Others sped past in frustration. But the tiny canine German Shepherd puppy refused to move. It stood its ground, barking desperately. Its bright eyes reflected the lights of passing cars. From a distance, it might look like just another stray dog, lost and confused. But there was something unusual about this scene. The puppy wasn't scared. It wasn't running away. It was stopping traffic on purpose. That's when a police patrol car pulled up. The officers noticed a commotion and slowed down. One of them stepped out, ready to remove the dog from the road. But as soon as he approached, the puppy did something that sent chills down his spine. It ran ahead a few feet, then stopped and turned back, staring straight at him as if begging him to follow. The officers exchanged glances. Something wasn't right, and so they followed. What they discovered just a few yards ahead changed everything. Before we begin this heartwarming story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Now, get ready for a moment that will touch your heart. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement as Officer James Carter stepped out patrol car. The radio crackled with background noise, but his focus was locked on the small figure standing in the middle of the road. A tiny German Shepherd puppy, no more than a few months old. It stood firm, blocking traffic. Its paws were planted, tail stiff, ears perked. Cars swerved around it, horns blaring, but the pup didn't move. It barked sharp, desperate sounds cutting through the night. James sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. After 10 years on the force, he had seen plenty of stray dogs wandering the streets. But there was something different about this one. He wasn't aimless. He wasn't lost. He was trying to stop them. James took a slow step forward, lowering his voice to a soothing tone. "Hey there, buddy. You can't be out here." The puppy let out another sharp bark, then suddenly turned and ran straight off the road, disappearing into the thick brush beside the highway. James tensed. Dogs didn't usually act like that. A normal stray would have either cowered or bolted in the opposite direction. But this one, it wanted him to follow. His partner, Officer Mike Reynolds, leaned out from the car. "What's going on?" James didn't answer. He was already moving, pushing through the overgrown grass where the puppy had disappeared. The ground was damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and rain. The pup's small form darted ahead, pausing every few feet to make sure James was still behind him. Then suddenly, the barking stopped. James's pulse quickened. He flicked on his flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness. The puppy stood still, now just a few yards ahead, beside something barely visible in the shadows. James took another step. His breath caught. There, half hidden beneath the thick brush, was a wrecked car. The vehicle was overturned, its body crushed against a tree. Glass was shattered across the ground. The metal was twisted and torn. Smoke curled up from the hood, the scent of burned rubber and gasoline hanging heavy in the air. James's training kicked in. He rushed forward, scanning the wreckage. Then he heard it, a faint, barely audible groan. Someone was inside. "Mike!" James shouted, waving his partner over. Mike was at his side in seconds, eyes widening at the sight. He grabbed his radio, calling for backup and an ambulance, while James pressed closer to the shattered window. Inside, barely visible in the dim light, was a woman. Her face was pale, streaked with blood. Her body was trapped between the crushed dashboard and the driver's seat. Her breaths were shallow. Her eyelids fluttered weakly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" James called out, his voice steady but urgent. She let out a weak, pained sigh. The puppy whimpered beside James, its small body pressed against the wreck, as if trying to protect her. And in that moment, everything made sense. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was her dog. This tiny German Shepherd puppy had run into traffic, risked its own life to bring help. James felt something tighten in his chest. "You did good, buddy," he murmured, reaching down to gently run a hand over the pup's head before turning back to the wreckage. The woman inside was still alive, and all because her dog had refused to give up on her. James moved quickly. The woman inside the car was slipping in and out of consciousness, her breath shallow, her face barely illuminated by the glow of his flashlight. He reached through the shattered window, carefully touching her arm. "Ma'am, stay with me. Help is on the way." She let out a weak moan, her head tilting slightly toward him, but her eyes remained shut. The crushed metal around her had caved in dangerously, and from the way her body was positioned, he knew she was pinned. They had to be careful. Mike was already relaying the situation through the radio, his voice tense. "We got a female trapped inside a vehicle, unstable wreckage. We need fire rescue ASAP." James's heart pounded as he checked for any other passengers, but the woman was alone, except for the puppy. The little German shepherd whined, pacing anxiously beside the wreck. Its small paws scraped against the gravel. It nudged the car with its nose, letting out short, sharp barks. James crouched beside it. "Is she yours, boy?" The pup whined again, ears flicking back. James exhaled, his mind racing. This dog had saved her life. If it hadn't run onto the road, no one would have noticed the wreck. No one would have found her in time. He reached out, giving the pup a firm pat. "You did good. Real good." The sound of sirens pierced the air. Flashing red and white lights illuminated the dark road as the fire department arrived. The paramedics were out in seconds, assessing the scene. The firefighters moved in with heavy tools to pry the car open. James stepped back, pulling the puppy with him to keep it from getting too close. It fought against his grip, trying desperately to stay near the wreck. "Easy, buddy. They're helping her." The process was slow. The firefighters worked fast, but the damage was severe. Every movement risked further injury. The woman stirred slightly, a small cry of pain escaping her lips as they began cutting through the metal. James felt the tension in his chest grow. "Hang in there," he murmured. Finally, after what felt like forever, they managed to pry the door open enough to carefully remove her. The paramedics moved in, stabilizing her neck and lifting her onto a stretcher. Her body was limp, her breaths ragged, but she was alive. The puppy squirmed, desperate to follow. As they lifted her into the ambulance, it barked, trying to jump in after her. James caught it just in time. "Whoa, not yet, buddy." The paramedic, a woman with short blonde hair, glanced down at the dog. "Is that hers?" James nodded. The paramedic hesitated, then gave him a small smile. "Let him ride with her." James released his hold, and the moment he did, the puppy scrambled inside, pressing its small body against the woman's side. The sight made something tighten in his throat. Loyalty. Pure, unshaken loyalty. As the ambulance doors closed, James exhaled, watching as the vehicle disappeared down the road. He felt Mike step up beside him. "Damn," Mike muttered. "That little guy saved her life." James nodded, still staring at the spot where the ambulance had been. "Yeah," he said softly. "He really did." James and Mike stood in the dim glow of their patrol car's headlights. The night air still heavy with the tension of what had just happened. The road was quiet now, only the distant hum of traffic reminding them of how easy the wreck could have gone unnoticed. James ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. His mind replayed the scene. The battered car, the unconscious woman, and the small, determined puppy that had refused to leave her behind. Mike let out a low whistle. "I've seen some loyal dogs before, but that one, that's something else." James nodded. "He didn't just stay with her. He ran into the road to stop us. If he hadn't," his voice trailed off, the weight of it sinking in. They both knew what would have happened. A wreck like that in such a dark and isolated stretch of road could have easily gone unseen for hours, and by then it might have been too late. James's radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to Unit 47, requesting an update on the accident." He lifted the radio to his mouth. "Victim extracted and en route to County General. Fire department cleared the scene. No other vehicles involved." "Copy that. Good work." Mike leaned against the car, arms crossed. "What do you think happens to the pup now?" James glanced at the empty road where the ambulance had disappeared. "If she makes it, he'll stay with her. And if she doesn't, The question hung between them. James didn't answer right away. He had seen plenty of abandoned animals, plenty of stories that didn't end the way they should. If the woman didn't survive, the puppy would be just another lost soul left to navigate a world that had already taken too much from him. Mike must have sensed his thoughts. You thinking what I'm thinking? James gave a small nod. Yeah, they didn't need to say it out loud. Tomorrow after the shift, James would be checking in on that dog because some bonds weren't meant to be broken. The next morning, James parked outside County General Hospital, gripping a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He wasn't even sure why he was here. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. Either way, he wasn't leaving until he got answers. Walking through the automatic doors, he approached the front desk. A tired-looking nurse glanced up. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for information on a woman brought in last night, car accident on Highway 19. The nurse tapped at her computer, scrolling through the list of recent admissions. "Name?" James hesitated. He had no idea. She seemed to understand. "We had one from an accident last night. She's stable but unconscious." Relief settled in his chest. She was alive. Then he asked the real question. "And the dog?" The nurse's expression softened. "The puppy. He hasn't left her side." That didn't surprise him. "She's in room 214. The little guy is curled up next to her. The doctors figured it was better to let him stay." James nodded his thanks and made his way down the hall. When he reached the room, he pushed the door open quietly. The woman lay in the hospital bed, and four attached to her arm. Her face was pale but peaceful. Beside her, curled up like he belonged there, was a German Shepherd puppy. His tiny chest rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. His small body pressed against hers. Even in sleep, his ears twitched as if ready to wake up at the slightest sound. James stepped inside. The pup's nose twitched, and his eyes fluttered open. The second he saw James, he perked up, lifting his head. His tail thumped weakly against the sheets, but he didn't move from the woman's side. James crouched beside the bed. "Hey there, buddy." The puppy let out a small whine, licking his lips. "You did good last night," James murmured. The woman stirred. It was faint, just a twitch of her fingers, but James saw it. A moment later, her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a soft breath as she woke up. Her eyes moved sluggishly around the room before landing on James. Confusion flickered across her face, then realization. The accident. Her voice was hoarse. James nodded. "You were trapped in your car, but you're okay." Her brows furrowed slightly. Then, as if suddenly remembering, she turned her head. The puppy's ears perked, and a quiet gasp escaped her lips. "He's..." Her voice cracked with emotion. James smiled slightly. "He never left you." Tears welled in her eyes as she reached out with slow, shaky fingers. The puppy immediately pressed into her touch, nuzzling her hand. His small tail wagged in relief. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "You saved me, didn't you?" The pup licked her fingers, and a small, broken laugh escaped her. James watched, feeling something shift in his chest. This dog hadn't just saved her life. He had fought for it. James cleared his throat. "Do you have any family we should call?" She hesitated, shaking her head. "No, it's just me and him." Her fingers curled gently into the puppy's fur. "His name is Shadow." "Shadow." The name fit. James nodded. "Well, Shadow's a hero." She looked at the tiny dog beside her, eyes filled with gratitude. "Yeah," she whispered. "He really is." James remained in the hospital room for a few more minutes, watching as the woman gently stroked the small German Shepherd puppy curl beside her. Shadow barely moved, except for the soft rise and fall of his chest. His warm brown eyes locked onto hers, as if making sure she wouldn't disappear again. The woman's fingers trembled as she brushed through his fur. Her voice was still weak. "If he hadn't run into the road, no one would have found me, would they?" James hesitated for only a second. "Probably not." She swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward the window. A long silence stretched between them before she finally whispered, "I owe him my life." James didn't argue. He had seen loyalty before, on the force, with K-9 officers and their handlers. But what Shadow had done wasn't just instinct, it was devotion. He shifted his stance, clearing his throat. Do you remember anything about the accident? What happened? She exhaled shakily, staring at the ceiling. I was driving home late. It was raining. A deer jumped onto the road. I swerved. Her eyes darkened. That's all I remember. James nodded. Your car was hidden pretty deep in the trees. If it weren't for Shadow, we might not have seen it for hours. Her hand tightened around the pup's small body, as if grounding herself in the reality of what could have happened. He's all I have, she admitted softly. James studied her for a moment. No family, no emergency contacts, just her and this dog clinging to each other. He had seen it before. People with no one left in the world except for the animals that loved them unconditionally. And in this case, Shadow hadn't just been a companion. He had been her guardian. The hospital door creaked open, and a nurse stepped inside, carrying a clipboard. She smiled when she saw Shadow still curled up beside the patient. Looks like he's not going anywhere. The woman gave a weak chuckle, running a hand over his head. Not a chance. The nurse turned to James. Thank you for bringing her in. James shook his head. It wasn't me. His gaze flickered to Shadow. It was him. The nurse's smile softened. Then I think he deserves a little reward. She turned back to the woman. Your vitals look good. You'll need rest, but you'll recover fully. Relief flashed across the woman's face. James caught the way she instinctively pulled Shadow closer, as if afraid this moment might slip away. The nurse scribbled something on her chart before turning back to James. Are you family? James shook his head. Just the officer who found them. The nurse nodded. Well, if you'd like, you're welcome to check in on them later. She'll be here for a few days. James glanced at the woman. She was watching him carefully, gratitude mixed with exhaustion in her expression. Maybe he shouldn't care. Maybe this wasn't his problem. But something about the tiny, determined pup who had risked everything to save his human had gotten under his skin. I might just do that, he said finally. Shadow let out a small sigh, nuzzling against his owner's side. Safe at last. 3 days later, James found himself back at the hospital. He told himself he was just checking in, making sure everything was fine, that Shadow and his owner were recovering. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. There was something about the way that tiny German Shepherd puppy had risked everything. Running into traffic, refusing to leave her side, knowing exactly what had to be done to get help. That kind of loyalty stuck with a person. As he walked through the hospital halls, he felt a strange sense of unease. He had seen plenty of tragic cases in his time as a cop. People who lost everything in an instant. People who walked out of hospitals only to return to nothing. When he reached room 214, he hesitated before knocking. A faint voice answered. Come in. He pushed the door open to find Shadow curled up on the bed, his tiny body stretched across the woman's legs. He looked up when James entered, his ears twitching but not moving from his spot. The woman, now looking much stronger than before, smiled when she saw him. Officer Carter, didn't think I'd see you again. James smirked. Guess I had to make sure Shadow wasn't causing any trouble. She ran a hand through the pup's fur. Not even a little. He hasn't left my side. James stepped closer, noting how much better she looked. More color in her face, more strength in her voice. How are you holding up? Her fingers absent-mindedly stroked Shadow's ears as she sighed. Physically, I'm fine. The doctors say I'll make a full recovery. She hesitated, her gaze dropping. I don't really know what comes next. James frowned. What do you mean? She let out a small, humorless laugh. I wasn't lying when I said it was just me and Shadow. I lost my job a few months ago. Bills started piling up. I was on my way out of town when the accident happened, trying to figure out my next move. She glanced down at the puppy. Now I don't even have a car. James felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had suspected something like this. He had seen people fall through the cracks. Good people who just needed one bad break to lose everything. Do you have anywhere to go? He asked. She shook her head. Not really. Silence stretched between them, only broken by the sound of the machines in the room. Shadow let out a small whine, pressing closer to her side, as if it could sense the unease in her voice. James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had come here expecting to check in, say a few words, maybe pet the dog once, and leave. But now, standing here looking at this woman who had no one but a tiny, heroic puppy to her name, something inside him wouldn't let him just walk away. "Look," he said, shifting slightly, "I know a guy who owns a kennel and works with service dogs. He trains them for police work, military support, even therapy. He's always looking for good people to help out." She blinked, surprised. "You think he'd hire me?" James shrugged. "I think it's worth a shot." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out why he was doing this. Then, finally, a small smile touched her lips. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," James said simply. Shadow let out a small bark, as if agreeing, and just like that, things started to change. A week later, James pulled up to a quiet stretch of land just outside the city. The K-9 training facilities stood in the distance, surrounded by rolling fields and enclosed training areas. It was one of the best in the region, a place where dogs were trained for police work, search and rescue, and therapy programs. Sitting in the passenger seat, beside him was Shadow. The once tiny German Shepherd puppy had grown noticeably in just a short time. His ears stood taller, his legs were stronger, but he still had that same sharp, determined look in his eyes. In the back seat, his owner, Emma, shifted nervously. She had been quiet the entire drive, staring out the window, lost in thought. James glanced at her. "You okay?" She let out a slow breath. "Yeah, I never thought my life would take me here." James understood. A few weeks ago, she had been trapped in a wrecked car, barely hanging on. Now, she was about to start a new job at a place she had never even considered before. Life had a funny way of turning around. As they stepped out of the car, the sound of barking and commands being shouted filled the air. Trainers were working with German shepherds in designated areas, some practicing scent detection, others running agility courses. A few officers were off to the side, working with their K-9 partners. A tall, broad-shouldered man approached, wiping his hands on his pants. His sharp blue eyes flicked to James first. "Carter, been a while." James smirked. "Yeah, well, figure it was time I introduced you to someone." He turned to Emma. "This is Emma, and that's Shadow, the reason we're all standing here right now." The man crouched slightly, extending a hand towards Shadow, who sniffed it cautiously before giving a small wag of his tail. "Good instincts," the man murmured, eyeing the pup. He straightened, turning back to Emma. "James told me what happened. Hell of a story." Emma nodded. "Yeah, I'm still trying to believe it myself." The man crossed his arms. "Well, if you're up for it, I could use another pair of hands around here. We work with all kinds of dogs, but I got a feeling this little guy's got something special." Emma looked down at Shadow, who stared back up at her as if waiting for her decision. She smiled, running her fingers through his fur. "He's already saved me once. Maybe it's time I learn how to help others too." James felt something settle in his chest, something that told him this was exactly where they were meant to be. Shadow let out a sharp bark, standing tall beside Emma. The little pup, who had once stood alone on a dark road, refusing to let anyone pass, refusing to let his owner be forgotten, now had a future, and he was ready for it. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change for Emma and Shadow. The K-9 training facility became their new home, a place where both of them could heal, learn, and find a sense of belonging. For the first time in a long time, Emma had structure, a routine, and a purpose. And for Shadow, it was clear from day one. He was meant for this. James visited occasionally, checking in between shifts. He watched from the sidelines as Shadow grew from a small, determined pup into a disciplined, intelligent dog. The trainers had noticed it too. While most puppies took months to grasp basic commands, Shadow learned in weeks. His instincts were razor sharp, his focus unshakable. He didn't just obey commands, he anticipated them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James leaned against the fence, watching Emma work with Shadow. She had changed too. The tired, lost woman he had found in the hospital had been replaced by someone stronger, more confident. She moved with purpose, guiding Shadow through an obstacle course. He jumped over hurdles, weaved through scent, and darted toward a target with precision. "He's a natural," a voice said beside James. James turned to see the facility's lead trainer, arms crossed, watching the scene with a knowing smile. "You ever see a dog learn this fast?" James asked. The man shook his head. "Not often. He's got something special. But it's not just him. It's them. He works for her." James watched his Shadow finish the course and immediately turned back to Emma, looking up at her for approval. She knelt, scratching behind his ears, laughing as he wagged his tail wildly. "Yeah, I see that." James smirked. The trainer exhaled. "I've been thinking once he's old enough, we could officially start his certification." James raised an eyebrow. "Certification for what?" The trainer turned to him. "Search and rescue." James glanced back at Shadow, who was now happily sitting by Emma, his tongue hanging out. A few weeks ago, that tiny dog had stood in the middle of a dark road, risking everything to save a life. Now he might just save more. James nodded. Sounds like the perfect job for him. And somehow, he knew Shadow was exactly where he was meant to be. Months passed, and Shadow's training intensified. What started as basic obedience evolved into advanced tracking and search and rescue drills. He was no longer just a small, determined pup. He was a force. Emma had changed too. She had gone from someone with no direction to a handler with confidence, skill, and a deep understanding of Shadow's potential. Their bond was unshakable. James visited whenever he could, watching from the sidelines. Every time he saw the same thing. Shadow never took his eyes off Emma, no matter the task, no matter the distractions. He was locked in, waiting for her command. One day, the head trainer approached Emma with a clipboard. "He's ready," he said simply. Emma swallowed hard. "For what?" "For the final certification test." The trainer turned to her. "If he passes, he'll be officially certified as a search and rescue canine." Emma looked down at Shadow, who sat at her feet, ears perked, waiting. She smiled. "Then let's do it." The test was grueling. Shadow had to locate a missing person in a dense wooded area with no scent trail and no clues. Emma's heart pounded as she gave the command. "Find them." Without hesitation, Shadow took off. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Emma felt the tension coil in her chest. Then a bark. She sprinted toward the sound, James close behind. Shadow stood beside a hidden figure in the brush, a trainer acting as a victim. His tail wagged slightly, but he stayed focused, waiting for Emma to confirm. The head trainer checked his watch. 7 minutes. He looked at Emma. "That's record time." Emma let out a shaky breath and knelt beside Shadow, running a hand through his fur. "You did it, boy." Shadow licked her face, letting out a happy whine. James smirked. Knew he would. The trainer handed Emma a document. "Congratulations. Shadow is now an official search and rescue canine." Emma looked at the certificate, then down at Shadow. She had lost everything once. Now she had found her purpose. And Shadow? He had been born to be a hero,